Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 4, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Okay, so the last sentence that I read was talking about the people, quote unquote, free persons of color remained predominant among Black leaders in many fields well into the 20th century, and they included W.B. Du Bois, Thomas Fortune, Fortune, Charles Waddell Chestnut, and that's 2 D's and 2 L's, Thurgood Marshall, John Hope Franklin, and many others. Most Black holders of doctoral degrees at the middle of the 20th century, as well as most Negroes working in the professions in the nation's capital at that time, were by all indications descendants of the antebellum, quote unquote, free persons of color, a group that was never more than 14% of the Black population. As a group, the quote unquote free persons of color also differed from the slaves in racial mixture, as in most of the Western Hemisphere. Freed slaves were often the offspring of those who freed them, and the adults freed more often female than male. While only 8% of the slaves set the stringent U.S. Census requirement of half or more white ancestry to be classified as mulatto, 37% of the quote-unquote free persons of color did. This is not to say that all the others in either category were of pure African ancestry, but there were very noticeable skin color differences between the more acculturated descendants of those freed before the Civil War and those freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. That noticeably greater success of the noticeably greater success of the former was often attributed to their white ancestry, which is crazy, both by whites and by some of the Negro elite themselves. But the historical and cultural antecedents of that success are undeniable. Moreover, the latter rise of Blacks to similar levels of achievement undermines the biological explanation of these internal differences among Blacks. The point here is that the cultural differences led to striking socioeconomic differences among Blacks, as they did among whites. In both races, those who lived within the redneck culture lagged far behind those who did not. Exactly, right? You are the company you keep. Even if it's your family members, you're going to become just like that. You know what I mean? If you don't get out of it, you don't strive to get out of it. That these cultural differences, that these cultural differences among Blacks also coincided with biological differences did not mean that biology explained the differences in performance. The offspring of white slave owners not only had a better chance of being freed, they also tended to have better opportunities while still enslaved, being more likely to be house servants rather than field hands, and in some cases living the lives of de facto free persons while still legally in bondage. Reconstruction era Black Senator Blanche K. Bruce, for example, was during the era of slavery tutored alongside his owner's son or other son, as many believed. Senator, okay? During the antebellum era, there were other mulatto offspring of white slave owners who were given special consideration and aid. Some were sent to Oberlin College, sometimes with an intermediary handling financial agreements, apparently to conceal the identity of the white father. This is not to say that most slave owners freed their mulatto offspring, but that of those Blacks freed voluntarily, mulattoes were far more common than among the slave population in general, and that women were freed more often than men. Moreover, this pattern prevailed throughout the Western Hemisphere. The point here is that the descendants of the quote-unquote free persons of color had a cultural history that served them better than the cultural history of the descendants of slaves. Even after the abolition of slavery ended differences in their legal status, whether by individual escapes from slavery, by voluntary manumissions in the antebellum South, or by general emancipation by law in northern states, a Black class of quote-unquote free persons of color emerged along before the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I was just thinking about how they were talking about earlier on in the book. When people were freed, they were seen like going however long that it took on foot or however they could get there, looking for their family. Now, I'm pretty sure that getting their freedom, they're like, there's morals, values, and standards there that they're not going to go hooping and hollering and stealing and all this other kind of stuff, that they want to be good, productive members of society. They want to continue or start businesses and make a life better for themselves and way better for their kids. So I'm pretty sure that those families were not dealing with what they're talking about, that like ghetto mentality and stuff. But anyway, moving on. The more prosperous of these families were able to educate their own children, sometimes through college, and I'm pretty sure that they pushed for education, right? And these were typically light-skinned people. I'm talking about those freed people I just spoke about, as well as people with generations of a head start in freedom and acculturation, as compared to the mass of enslaved blacks. The net result was that the elite among American Negroes tended to be and to remain for generations after emancipation, a racially mixed group that married among themselves and formed a socially exclusive class. Among 19th century Negroes in Philadelphia, for example, 85% of mulatto men married mulatto women, and 93% of black men married black women. This was not solely a matter of color prejudice, for there were major behavioral differences between the two groups. The mulatto neighborhoods had lower crime rates, and a higher percentage of their children attended school as compared to the black neighborhoods. Even though it can hardly be claimed that school attendance or crime rates are genetically predetermined, in short, there were major cultural differences, and these differences in turn produced other differences, such as higher occupational status, better housing, and more wealth among the mulattoes. Nor was the pattern confined to Philadelphia. All across the country, north and south, the elite of the Negro community were lighter in complexion than the masses, and very self-conscious and sometimes snobbish about that fact. This remained so through at least the first half of the 20th century. Among the consequences of the extreme range of education and acculturation within the Negro community has been the larger society's erection of racial barriers provoked by black rednecks, which barriers then deeply offended those individuals and at the other end of the cultural spectrum. These barriers based on race prevented cultural elites from separating themselves as much as they would like from the lower class blacks with whom they were forced to live in proximity and to share institutions, yet protests against racial barriers had to be made in the name of all light or dark, leading to charges of hypocrisy against the elites who spearheaded protests against white social and economic barriers while maintaining their own social and economic barriers against the black lower class. The internal social barriers within the black community became more pronounced at the same time as white barriers against blacks in general suggest that more than coincidence was involved, since both occurred in the wake of the mass arrival of black rednecks from the south among the behavioral differences between the black elites and the black masses was that the elites had more stable families, with separation or divorce being rare among them. It took more than money or a light complexion to enter the social circles of the black elite. Behavioral standards were also essential, and individuals who met these standards could be admitted with little money and regardless of complexion. Though the history of black rednecks meant that few would rise to elite levels. External relations. Cultural differences affected not only the internal department of the black community, but also the way the black community as a whole was treated by the larger surrounding white community, and the way in which that treatment varied over time. The small number of blacks who were free in colonial times were joined over the generations by increasing numbers of blacks who were either released from bondage or who escaped on their own. The growth of this largely unacculturated population, quote-unquote fugitives in the rough, in the words of black historian Carter G. Woodson, W-O-D-S-O-N, in the northern cities during the first half of the 19th century, brought both social barriers of discriminatory laws barring black children from schools and black adults from equal access to public accommodations. Yet as these black communities grew more acculturated over time and began to rise economically, these laws and practices began to be relaxed in many northern cities in the latter part of the 19th century. Writing in 1899, W.B. Du Bois noted, in quotes, a growing liberal spirit toward the Negro in Philadelphia, end quote, in which, in quotes, the community was disposed to throw off the trammels, Trammels, brush away petty hindrances, and to soften the harshness of race prejudice, end quote, leading among other things to blacks being able to live in white neighborhoods. Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, noted similar changes in New York City, and similar trends emerged in in other northern cities in the last quarter of the 19th century. In Detroit, blacks who had been denied the vote in 1850 were voting in the 1880s, and in the 1890s, blacks were being elected to public office by a predominantly white electorate in Michigan. The black upper class in Detroit at the time had regular social interactions with whites, and their children attended high schools and colleges with whites. In Illinois, during the same era, legal restrictions on access to public accommodations for blacks were removed from the law, even though there were not enough black voters at the time to influence public policy, so that this represented changes in the white public opinion. By all indications, northern black urban communities were themselves becoming cleaner. Northern black community, cleaner, safer, and more orderly. I was like, did I read that right? Cleaner, safer, and more orderly during this era of improving race relations. So changes in white public opinion were not merely inexplicable mood swings. Neither were the later retrogressions in race relations in the North, which followed a massive influx of black migrants from the South. Black rednecks at the beginning of the 20th century. As late as 1890, 9/10 of all blacks in the United States still lived in the South, but those who lived in northern urban communities were largely from families long settled there. Most blacks living in New York State, for example, were born in New York State. In short, there were settled communities in both regions, and by all indications, the northern black communities at that time were acculturating to the norms of the northern white society around them. But all of that changed radically within a relatively few years as a massive migration from the South not only enlarged northern black communities, but transformed them culturally. Oh my gosh. As that's terrible. It had to be it had to feel like an invasion, Total oh my God, culture shock type stuff. I can't even imagine. In 1900, for the first time, more than half of all the blacks living in New York State had been born outside that state. Newcomers from the South became growing majorities in northern urban black communities and other states as well. The record-breaking migrations of blacks from the South to the North during the first decade of the 20th century was nearly tripled during the second decade, and that in turn was almost doubled again during the decade of the 1920s. Moreover, the proportion of these migrants coming from the Deep South, as distinguished from the Upper South, increased over time, which meant that the least educated and least acculturated became a growing proportion of the black migrant population moving into the northern cities. There were about 30,000 blacks living in Chicago in 1900, but this grew to well over 100,000 by 1920 and more than 277,000 by 1940. In Detroit, the black population grew from a little more than 4,000 in 1900 to more than 40,000 in 1920 and over 149,000 by 1940. New York City's black population was a little more than 60,000 in 1900, but grew to more than 150,000 by 1920 and more than 450,000 by 1940. Writing in the midst of these massive migrations, historian Carter G. Woodson predicted, end quote, the maltreatment of the Negro will be nationalized by this exodus, end quote. This is what had happened 100 years earlier, and now it happened again. The sheer numbers of these new black migrants from the South not only overwhelmed the relatively small black populations in northern cities demographically in the early 20th century, their very different behavior patterns shocked both blacks and whites at the time, as witnessed by adverse comments from earlier black settlers and black press denouncing the new arrivals from the South as vulgar, rowdy, unwashed, and criminal. Nor were these conclusions without foundation. For example, a study in the early 20th century, Pennsylvania, found that the rate of violent crimes by blacks who had migrated there was nearly 5 times the rate of such crimes by blacks born in Pennsylvania. In Washington, the rate of births out of wedlock more than doubled with a large influx of Southern blacks during the late 19th century. One indication of the white reaction was that blacks no longer remained as free to live in white neighborhoods. This represented a major retrogression in race relations. In the late 19th century, racial segregation in housing in northern cities was no longer what it had once been, or what it would become again in the years ahead. In Detroit, as early as 1860, no neighborhood was even 50% black. In Chicago, as late as 1910, more than two-thirds of the black population lived in neighborhoods where most residents were whites. But after the mass migrations of blacks from the South, attempts by blacks to move into white neighborhoods in Chicago were met with violence, including bombings. New York, Philadelphia, and Washington were also cities which began to restrict blacks to ghettos only after the massive influx of Southern blacks and their redneck culture. In many cities, blacks were prevented from moving into existing white neighborhoods, but in other cases, whites simply moved out when blacks moved in. Now, you know that they say that, oh, they put us in whatever, they wouldn't allow us, and it was the wrong side of the tracks and whatever else. It wasn't them that did it, right? They personally did it to themselves by the way that they were treating people, leaving trash about the bombings, the robberies, the crime rate and stuff, and the attacks and the sexual assaults and things. They literally did it to themselves. Let's put them over there, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then even if there wasn't a situation where they said, let's put them over there, when they moved in, people, whites and blacks alike, were like, peace out. We're going someplace else, right? And then it would just be taken over by those rowdy types of people that had no morals, values, standards, and all of that, right? This is crazy town banana pants. Harlem, the first of the great northern black ghettos, was still predominantly white as late as 1910. And this is where that victim mentality comes in. And you hear these people talking about it, and people are like, oh, that's an Uncle Tom Coon sellout, or whatever they say, working for the white man or whatever. And it's literally their own doing, right? Anyway, good Lord. Racial segregation in housing became an explicit law in Baltimore in 1911, and one way or another, residential segregation became the norm in northern cities. Residential segregation was not the only retrogression in race relations during this period. In some northern and midwestern cities where schools had been racially integrated for years, black children were now segregated from white children after the mass influx of blacks from the South. Hold on a second. Hold on. So you mean to tell me they were attending school together? They were together? And then when they had the massive influx of Southerners that were like totally on a whole other level of crazy as far as how they were acting, they literally, for safety purposes, sounds like they separated them out. Okay, so I feel like they should have only allowed the people who had common sense and logic to stay there, but others, you can't be mingling with us, right? Oh my gosh. Ugh. Blacks in Washington were no longer allowed in white theaters, restaurants, or hotels, and their opportunities to work in white-collar occupations shrank. They freaking did it to themselves. They're acting like the white man did it. Oh my God, this is crazy. W.E.B. Du Bois summarized these retrogressions this way. Yet it has everywhere been manifest in the long run that while a part of the Negroes were native born and trained in the culture of the city, the others were immigrants, largely ignorant and unused to city life. There were, of course, manifold exceptions, but this was the rule. Thus, the history of the Negro in northern cities is the history of the rise of a small group by accretion, accretion, from without, but at the same time periodically overwhelmed by them and compelled to start over again, when once the material had been assimilated. In Philadelphia, for example, the native-born blacks had advanced, but according to Du Bois, they were, quote-unquote, overwhelmed and dragged back by black migrants from the South, he added, in quotes. New York, the native-born have been perhaps even more completely overwhelmed. Yeah, I'm sure it's like a freaking like, what the heck are y'all doing? You kind of thing. This pattern is confirmed in places where the retrogression in race relations took place at a different time because of local differences and the time and a large scale migration of blacks from the South. In San Francisco, for example, that mass influx took place during the Second World War as blacks from the South were attracted by jobs in newer production facilities, notably the Kaiser, Kaiser shipyards. I'll leave it at that. Don't go hang again. We need a good chance to meet again. Love you, mean it.